Thank you so much, Mel. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. My name is Alistair Lee. As Mel said, I've been working on the Adobe Connect team now for quite some time. What I want to talk about today, though, is really how we can create effective virtual classrooms, how we can be more effective in the virtual classroom. And I'm going to start actually with a poll. So we'll start getting your feedback right away. I'd like to know what you believe or what you found if you've hosted these virtual sessions in the past is the biggest challenge of delivering your content online. So if you can type your answer in the poll pod there that's in the middle of the screen, just hit enter or the right arrow at the very end. We've got some answers coming in. I will show these answers to everybody as we start getting some more in here. Let me go ahead. I'm going to broadcast the results as we're getting lots of answers now. Thank you for everybody that's typed something in. Let's see here. Keeping learner attention, keeping levels of engagement from participants. A couple of voices tend to dominate the conversation. Absolutely. That's something that I've found in the past as well. Technological challenges, something that I've often seen when I've asked this question to a group. Keeping my audience, engagement I'm seeing here, no immediate user feedback, keeping people engaged, especially with self-directed learning. Great answers here. Keeping the attention of all, keeping learners engaged, personal connect and engagement, focus, motivation, time to create. Lots of really great answers there. The common theme that we're seeing is really around engagement, and that's obviously what's driven the title of today's session here. We put it right in the title. So how do we create an engaging virtual session, whether that's a virtual classroom, which is mostly what we're going to talk about today, or even something like a webinar? How do we make it engaging? I'm going to talk through some of the pillars that I think are really important for engagement, but I'm really excited to hear from our customer speaker today as well with a real-world example of how he drives engagement in his virtual classrooms and his sessions. Some of the topics that I want to cover today, though, around driving engagement are content. How do we use content, not just create content, but use different types of content to drive engagement? What can we do to make our content more effective? I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I do want to touch on it because I think it's one of the keys to creating something that is engaging. We're going to spend a lot of time, both Bob and I today, talking about interaction. I think interaction, again, is one of those pillars of engagement. And then finally, I'm going to talk a lot about design. Now, design is part of everything. It's part of our content. Obviously, we're designing our content. We are designing interactive elements into our virtual classroom. But I wanted to call it out here as a third pillar or a third key concept because I want you to think about designing the learner journey. So we're not just talking about designing our content and creating, some really nice looking PowerPoint slides. We're thinking about that learner journey from the second really we're inviting them to our virtual classroom. What does that email invitation look like? How does that set expectations for our learners when they get that email? When they come into our virtual session, what does the lobby look like? What expectations are we setting there? How are we designing that entire experience from that email invitation, getting them into our virtual classroom, right to the follow-ups after our session has been delivered? So that's really why I've got design here as a third component. Even though it's part of everything that we're doing, I really want to drive home this idea of designing the learner's journey or the learner's experience from start to finish. And that's what we're going to look at today. Before we get into the content, though, let me, instead of using a poll here, I'm going to use my agree to disagree pod. You'll notice a pod has just popped up below my headshot. And the question is interaction required? Do you need to have interaction to keep people engaged throughout your session? So if you agree with that, click on the green check mark. And if you disagree with that, you can click on the red X. You don't have to click submit or anything else. Just click on the button that you think best answers this. Is interaction required? Is it necessary for engagement? We've got a good mix here. It's about 80-20 split, 78-22 now. It's changing as we're going on. I'm going to side actually with the minority. I think interaction is a really good idea. I don't think it's absolutely required. If our content is incredible, and I'm thinking about an example like Avengers Endgame, which back before the pandemic hit, we used to go to theaters. I sat in a theater. This has a 3-hour runtime. I sat through all 3 hours of this, and I can say I was engaged for the entire runtime. Now, I should point out that Marvel here had a $356 million budget to create this. I'm guessing, I don't know for a fact, but I'm guessing your budgets are lower, probably not even in the hundreds of millions. You guys are probably working with tens of millions at the most. I joke. But you know, that can be what it takes to create super engaging content if you're not adding interaction. What interaction helps us do is create sessions that turn viewers into participants. It requires participation. There's a reason that in Adobe Connect we use the term participants. We've got 3 different roles: a host, a presenter, and a participant. And the idea is that we don't just have viewers. You know, if we're talking about a virtual classroom, or even if we're talking about a webinar like what we're doing today, we want to turn our viewers into participants, because by participating, by providing some interaction, we can really help drive focus, we can help drive engagement. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. Some good comments here from Stephanie. She's saying in the chat, it depends on the content. Engagement can be gamification, polls, knowledge checks that involve matching, moving elements on a screen. That's really what it comes down to. And when you're thinking about your content, what I would encourage you to do is using multiple types of content, just like Stephanie's saying here. Typically, we have a lot of our content that we use for training in PowerPoint format today. That's how, especially in the enterprise, we tend to think. We think in PowerPoint, we structure this in PowerPoint, and when we think about designing our training sessions, we often think about that in PowerPoint. The key here is that we are using different types of content. So we're adding interaction to create participation and create participants. But even if we're using non-participatory content, by mixing it up a bit, by keeping it simple, by keeping it straightforward, by mixing in things like video, things like images, things like whiteboards, even if a learner is just watching an instructor use a whiteboard to annotate on that, that can be a little more visually engaging. Let's talk about interaction, though. So if we do want to add interaction to our sessions, what are some good ways to do that? So I'm going to have another poll here. So here the question is, how do you enable interaction in your virtual sessions? What are some of the things that you can do? If you've got a virtual classroom, you're not standing up in front of a physical classroom, but if you've got a virtual classroom, your learners are coming in, how do you enable interaction for those learners? Give people a second here just to fill this out. Excellent. So getting some results here. I'm going to go ahead and broadcast the results now that people are starting to type some in. So polls, breakout rooms, quizzing. I'm seeing hands-on coursework at the top, whiteboards, breakout rooms. Ask a question. Be curious. I think that's one of the best ways to add interaction as an instructor, is just to be curious. Flashcards, polls, forums, interact with them. Yeah, the question really is, how do we interact with them? Various tools, but with a good lesson plan, it can be, oh, that was just changed. Ask how their day was. Why are they here? And I see that person has put adult trainer in parentheses, and that's really important when we're talking about delivering e-learning or delivering learning content to adults. We need to sometimes adjust that, and again, set those expectations. We'll talk about that as we get into design. Stephanie in the chat has put online bingo game. Love that idea. Chat box. Use annotation tools to respond to questions. Some fantastic ideas here. Bob's going to show a bunch of examples that he's using in his sessions. I don't want to step on his feet, but I've got a couple of different buckets that I've created to think about interaction in the sessions that I'm running. And I put these in different buckets based on complexity as well as the time or preparation needed for each of these interaction categories. So in the basics, I've got what I think a lot of people have recommended. Things like chat is an easy way to interact with people. Polls, again, something really easy to do. You can create a poll, multiple choice poll, or as you've just seen, it could be a short answer poll where people are typing in their responses. Status options. Mel talked about the status options in the intro, being able to set your status to agree or disagree. I had something similar with the agree to disagree pod that I put on the stage a few minutes ago. It's back here. This I love as a way to interact with people because it requires literally no preparation at all. I can simply ask a question, go to my agree to disagree pod. Is everybody watching the Olympics? Hit, agree if you are, hit disagree if you're not. And that was not a question I prepared ahead of time. The wonderful thing about the status options is that you can bring it up at a moment's notice. And this counts as interaction. So as instructors, we should be aiming for interaction every 3 to 5 minutes is the ideal. When we talk to some of the best virtual classroom instructors out there, the advice used to be 5 to 7 back when I started in the industry. It's gone down to 3 to 5. And as I talk to people like Mel and some of the other experts in the field, they're now even saying every 2 to 3 minutes is ideal in a virtual classroom situation, not necessarily for a webinar. So we want to drive that interaction, and it doesn't all have to be super advanced. It can be something as simple as asking a yes or no question. In the second bucket, I've got intermediate interaction mechanisms, things like using the whiteboard, using annotations on a whiteboard. One of the things that you'll see in some examples we look at today is that a whiteboard doesn't actually have to be a blank white board, even though it's called the whiteboard. They're actually the annotation tools are what we're speaking to with the whiteboard. So when we say use a whiteboard for interaction, we're talking about giving our learners a set of tools like markers and highlighters and shapes so that they can interact with content in the virtual classroom. So as I said, you'll see some examples of that. Breakout rooms, these take a little more preparation, but they are an ideal way to enable team collaboration. So having learners learn from other learners, work together as a group to accomplish something. Audio and video, another great way if used effectively. Today, you'll notice that everybody's joined in essentially a listen-only mode. So Bob and I and Mel are really the only folks that can speak and turn on our cameras. But in a virtual classroom, you may want to enable audio and video to some of the learners so that they can ask questions orally or verbally, that they can interact. Maybe this is something that is just done in a breakout room, or maybe it's something you enable throughout the entire session. The idea is this is another way that we can add interaction. In terms of the advanced bucket, you'll see in the examples, we can add things like learning interactions, build something in authoring tools like Adobe Captivate, and actually bring it into our virtual classrooms to enable a little more advanced interaction, having drag and drop exercises. I think Stephanie had suggested that earlier as a way to deliver interaction. We can do that with e-learning authoring tools and actually bring in some of those courses like an online bingo game or a drag and drop activity directly into our virtual classroom. All of this takes a little more preparation, a little more pre-work in terms of actually creating it versus something like a poll, which you're just typing in a question. But the payoff is bigger as well. So these experiences become even more memorable, and we can drive even higher engagement with some of these. I also want to talk a bit about design. As I said, when we're talking about design here, we're talking about the design of the learner experience, thinking about that learner's journey from start to finish. Let me move back to my agree to disagree pod. Let me clear out this existing numbers here. Who knows what this is? We've got it on the screen right now. See if anybody recognizes it. Hit agree if you know what it is. Hit disagree or the X if you're not sure. So far, everybody hitting the green checkbox. Oh no, a few people. now hitting the red X. So this is, for those who aren't familiar, this is the storyboard for a movie called The Star Wars. This is something that George Lucas created back in the 70s. And this is something that virtually every filmmaker does, whether they're making a feature-length film or a short. They want to map out the entire story that they're going to tell. So they think about it. They think about all of the different shots they want in that movie. And some of these are what we'd call wide shots. In George's case, he's literally got multiple, moons or planets in the frame at the same time, along with a massive starship. Some of them are close-ups, where we're really close to an individual in that shot. We can see the expression on their face. I mean, not so much with Darth Vader, but with most characters, you'd actually see the expression on their face. The idea, though, is that the filmmaker is telling a story, and they're controlling the focus. They're controlling the attention of the audience. They're bringing in that focus in certain cases where they need to. And we can do the same thing with our virtual classrooms. The way this works in Adobe Connect is that we've got layouts that we can use, similar to a storyboard, where we can map out what the virtual classroom session should look like. Where do I want a lot of content on the screen, where there's lots of things to interact with, versus maybe just bringing in a single piece of content to drive that narrative focus. So let me show you what I mean. Before I pass it off to Bob to give you a real-world example, I'm going to share my own screen here to give you an example of a virtual classroom that I've created. Let me just make sure I'm sharing the right screen here. Yeah. So this is essentially a fictional example. This is a room that I created to deliver some training to managers as people are coming back into the workplace. Now I'm using Adobe Connect here, but a lot of these same principles will apply to whatever technology that you're using. The way that Adobe Connect works is that all of the functionality is delivered through these things called pods. So each of these boxes on my screen is a pod, and I've got a pods menu for different things, different types of features that I can share. So if I want to share my screen or share some content, I'd use a share pod. If I wanted to share notes, I'd share a notes pod. My webcam, I'd share the video pod, chat, files, web links, polls. And as an instructor, or as a host in this meeting, I can add whatever pods I'd like onto the stage. I can resize them. And everything I do is synchronized. So all of the learners in this room see exactly what I'm setting up for them to see. And in this way, I can create an experience that is really defined by the instructor. On the right-hand side, over here where I've got my mouse, are what we call layouts in Adobe Connect. And a layout is simply a grouping of pods that I've set up ahead of time. So I can move from one set of pods to another set of pods. And I'm using these layouts in the same way that I'd use a storyboard if I was creating a film to really tell a story and to drive the focus of the learners in my room. So I don't want to spend too much time here because I want to make sure we get to Bob's section, but I'll just kind of give you some highlights of how we're using these layouts to really design the flow of our virtual classroom. First of all, with the lobby layout, you'll notice and this looks actually very similar to the layout that we use today. You'll notice that we've got some interactive elements that we're already starting to add to the session. So we've got something like an image up here to let people know they're in the right session. Same thing we had in today's lobby. Today we had a countdown timer, but there's a clock in this room because it's a lobby. People are waiting for things to begin. But you'll notice we've also got a chat pod and a poll on our lobby layout because we want to set that expectation of interaction right from out of the gate. So even as people are joining the lobby, they're becoming familiar with how to interact with the tools, and they may be getting the expectation that there will be interaction throughout the session. And so we move from one, I don't want to delete that layout. We move from one layout to another. Here's a welcome layout where we can go through the housekeeping. Again, something we did in the webinar today as well. To an introductory layout where we can introduce our speakers, to our PowerPoint layout where we may be delivering our content, to a video layout where here, again, we're establishing focus. So we're getting rid of the chat, we're getting rid of the attendees list, we're getting rid of everything but the content itself, because when we're thinking about design, we're thinking about how to draw the focus of the user, and we're thinking about how to add interaction. Um, we'll come back to this if there's time, but rather than showing you this fictional example, what I'd like to do is hand it over to Bob Kennedy from Transamerica to talk about how he's using some of these same elements.
All right, thanks, Alistair. And as Mel said in her introduction, I've been in training and development for over 25 years, coaching C-level executives, managing corporate training departments, and teaching learning professionals how to be more effective. And it's been my passion in each of those circumstances to show others how to increase learner engagement and learning retention, because in today's learning environments, especially these days where a lot of that training is happening virtually, those are two factors I believe should be integrated into every training experience. Now, Alistair focused on how your webinars can be more engaging using content, interaction, and design within Adobe Connect. I'm going to show you creative things you can do within the Connect environment that not only create higher engagement, but also higher learning retention. Now, I'm going to launch a quick poll here, and I would like each of you to submit your answer to this question. Now, according to research by anthropologist Christine Boring, how much information do you think learners retain 2 days after a typical learning event? Let's get your response. All right, I'll give you another 5 seconds. Anyone who hasn't weighed in yet, feel free to weigh in, and then I'll broadcast the results. All right, here's what you had to say. 50% of you, or I'm sorry, 3% of you said, one person said about 50%. 50% content retained after 2 days. 3 of you, 9%, said about 42%. The majority of you, 16 of you, said 30%. Now, 12 of you said 18%, maybe getting a little on the cynical side there. By the way, thank you for answering that poll. The answer is only 30%. 30%. But here's the kicker. When training is built around participant engagement, which a lot of times includes interaction, guess what learning retention is after even 2 weeks? According to Christine Boring's research, it's 70%. 70%. To me, that's worth sitting up and taking notice. I think learning retention is the holy grail for learning professionals, because if people aren't going to remember what it is we're sharing with them, the training we do ends up being a futile exercise. That's why I'm so passionate about learning engagement and learning retention. Now, I'm going to show you the application of learning engagement and retention concepts really as they relate specifically to virtual learning. But I think a lot of what I share with you can also be applied in classroom learning as well. So let's jump in. Oh, I jumped ahead. Sorry about that, Alistair. So for every learning event I create and deliver, I apply 5 principles, and throughout this presentation, I'll share those principles with you. They are, first, remember to add elements into your layout that help make your presentation more rich and engaging. Second, have your learners process information that leads them to making decisions. Third, create engaging processes in Adobe Connect that reinforce your concepts. Fourth, create interactions that are experiential, tactile, unexpected, and even fun. And that tactile part might have caught a few of yours attention. I'll explain that a little bit more as we get to that. And finally, make the complex things that you do appear simple to the learner. Now, in teaching you those engagement and learning retention principles, I'm going to show you the evolution I took our Adobe Connect presentations through to accomplish it. So let me start with this example. This is very typical of how we use Adobe Connect when I first started with my company. Now, I would say that this is a decent use of the space, using a share pod for the PowerPoint, a chat pod, another pod for sharing file files that participants can download and maybe use during the webinar, and also a notes pod with audio dial-in instructions and who to contact if participants were experiencing any technical issues. Now, this layout is functional, but not really what I would call particularly engaging. Now, remember this layout because, as I said, I'm going to take you on a progression from this layout where we started a couple of years ago to where we are now with layouts and elements we began adding in between to make our webinars much more engaging through Connect. This is a layout with a poll for a webinar we conducted called 6 Thinking Hats. This webinar was called 6 Thinking Hats. The first thing you'll notice with the layout is that I added a pod on the upper left corner with the trainer's card, just like what you see with Alistair's and my layouts. This card was intended to do a couple of things. First, it added a visually appealing element to the layout that was always in the corner throughout the entire webinar. Second, it added personal interest so that participants could identify the trainer's voice with their face, just like what you're doing right now. Now, when it comes to engagement, having a way to link the voice they're hearing with the face and name helps make their experience even a little more rich and engaging. So the first principle is to remember to add elements such as this trainer's card into your layout that help make your presentation more rich and engaging. Now in this layout, notice that we have a poll in the upper middle. Our polls can have as few as 2 choices, or as in this case, 6 choices. Now, I probably wouldn't provide any more than 6 choices so that my learners aren't having to spend too much time processing information. But here's the really cool thing about offering so many choices. The cool thing is that they can see how their choice contrasts with all the other learners in the session. I love comparing and contrasting in my learning sessions. Now for this class, we had 75 people, so having more choices works. If I only had, 10 or so participants, I probably wouldn't offer so many choices because of the chance learners would only migrate to 2 or 3 of them. The choices not selected might feel like they're just like we're just doing the poll to fill space, and just filling space isn't something really that engages learners. So everything that I do, that you do, should have intentionality. We use this poll with a lot of intentionality because later in the webinar we brought it back, which I'll show you in just a moment. This poll is asking participants which of the thinking hats, which of the hats they wear based on a brief description of each hat. Now I copied this layout that we presented early in the webinar, and I brought it back near the end of the webinar with a little bit of a difference that looks like this. Now, when we introduced this layout near the end of the webinar, we asked participants to remember which hat they chose in the earlier poll, which is the one on the left. And between that layout early in the webinar and this one, we've gone in depth with what each colored thinking hat represents. Now, we brought in the second poll near the end of the webinar, asking them which hat they wanted to wear more. That's the poll on the right. So as a learning retention tool, this is a valuable technique because it challenges them to process which thinking hat they felt they were earlier and contrast it to a thinking hat they want to start wearing more as after the learning event. So this process requires learners to process the information we presented in order for them to make a choice. I love it when we ask learners to make a choice. As insignificant as that choice may seem, the thinking process that brought them to that choice is going to stay with them in the form of learning retention long after the learning event. So the second principle to remember is that asking your learners to process information that leads them to making choices is highly engaging and a very effective way to create higher learning retention. Now, before we move on, there's something else I want to point out all the way to the right side of the slide. Notice that notice all those layouts there. For this webinar, I think we had something like 20 layouts. We don't normally have quite that many, but you shouldn't be concerned with having too many layouts so long as they're serving a purpose and you can keep them organized. In this instance, I think we had 9 different layout in the I was just about to start counting, but in this instance, I think we had 9 different layouts that were just videos, here's one of the Thinking Hats videos, and Alistair kind of referred to this a little bit. This is a video where I'm being a little bit goofy in the video, wearing a yellow hat and behaving like a yellow hat person behaves. The video isn't terribly long, only 16 seconds, but it's an effective change-up to the standard slide-to-slide PowerPoint with a poll or two thrown in. In this section of the webinar, this is how we did this section with the videos. In this part of the webinar, we presented a thinking hat concept, showed a video example of that concept. That didn't have to be real long. Then we presented another concept followed by a video and so on until we got through each of the concepts. And by doing this, we were able to keep the webinar moving at a fairly fast pace while making the content interesting and engaging. I'll tell you what, we got such great feedback from our learners using this technique that now we're trying to figure out ways to incorporate it into other webinars. And by the way, one of the things I love about Adobe Connect is that it gives us the opportunity to incorporate a lot of different media, such as graphics, audio, video, polls, chats, downloadable workbooks. And these might seem like advanced features, kind of like Alistair talked about, but actually they're pretty easy to do. And in this case, adding video into Connect was easy, and it played really flawlessly during the webinar. Now, before I move on, I want to talk about using multiple polls, which you just saw. This is another form of a poll called a short answer poll in Adobe Connect that we use during a class called What's My Communication Style? It's the same poll. It's the same type of poll Alistair was using earlier, where you were able to type in your answer. And just saw something a little strange happen, but I'm just going to keep moving on. Now, after we had shown our learners 4 different communication styles, we wanted them to process that information in a tangible and memorable way. So we introduced 4 polls on one layout where they had to type their answer into each one, starting with the one on the left. We started with the 4 empty polls, of course, and went through each communication style one by one, asking them to think of a celebrity they felt embodied that particular communication style. Now, by having them process what we had just taught them about each communication style and then associate it with a celebrity, it helped solidify each of the styles in their mind. Then, by asking them to type into each poll a celebrity's name, there became a tactile sense associated with it. There's that tactile there that we use. We use that a couple of different ways, that tactile sense. By creating an engaging learning process that's even fun for learners, we developed an exercise that would make the concepts more tangible and memorable. And that's the third principle. Use tools in Adobe Connect to create engaging learning processes that reinforce your concepts so that your concepts become more memorable. Now, remember this layout where I put in the trainer's card as an engaging element? In this webinar called Be a Career Architect, I also included my card since I was interacting with learners throughout the webinar. But I started adding another visual element at the end of our webinars, and that was, it was somewhat self-serving. At the bottom middle part of the page, I developed a graphic and laid it into a share pod that promoted upcoming webinars. Pretty straightforward and easy to do, but it's another element that we added, and it has visual appeal. Now, remember how many, I want to point something else out. Remember how many layouts were in the webinar with the videos? I think there were like 20. Check out how many layouts are in this webinar, just 6. I'm really cautious to only use the appropriate number of layouts that serve the purpose of delivering an engaging webinar. Now, remember the trainer and producer cards on the upper left-hand corner, because I'm going to show you something really cool I did to make our learning space even more engaging. And let me give you a little background first. With all of the elements that we were adding, I kind of felt like our layouts were getting too busy with pods. On this layout alone, we had 6 pods, and sometimes we end up having even several more. So I wanted to scale back on pods And I came up with this solution. So notice the graphic I inserted along the bottom of the share pod. It accomplishes the same as the layout I just showed you with the 6 pods, but I've reduced the number of pods to 3 by combining our trainer card and my card in the graphic along with what was in the notes pod that explained to learners what to do if they were experiencing audio or other webinar related issues. Now, some of you are already familiar, who are already familiar with Adobe Connect are probably asking, Bob, how did you do that? Well, let me tell you, it couldn't be more easy. First, I looked up the standard dimensions of a background in Adobe Connect, which is 1920 pixels wide by 1200 pixels high. Then I created a graphic in Photoshop. Now you can use whatever program you have available to you, of course. I used Photoshop with those dimensions, and instead of having graphics and informational elements in pods, I simply put them into my background graphic along the bottom, saving the top area above for my pods that I did use. I inserted the background into my room and pinned it to the lower left corner so that no matter what size monitor my learners had, they would have the same experience of being able to see these graphics. Now, wouldn't you say this layout is much cleaner and more visually inviting? And by the way, the name of the webinar is very faint in the background. That was on purpose since I didn't want the background graphics to be too busy visually. Now that I was, having some fun stretching the bounds of what we could do in Adobe Connect, I started thinking, what other engaging elements can I add to our webinars? What can I do in our webinars? And that thought really led to this. How about a couple of graphics floating above a couple of chats? This is an employment law webinar that I needed to create, and at one point I wanted to challenge our learners with 2 different points of view. And of course you can do agree or disagree, but I wanted to try something a little different and possibly a little more engaging. And so I wanted to challenge our learners with 2 different points of view, and I asked them to side with one view or the other. And so I inserted 2 chat pods, and as my presenter laid out a scenario, we had our learners take a side as to whether the scenario was legal or illegal, but also explain in just a few words why. Now, how the heck did I create those graphics? What I did is I put those graphics on the graphics on the background along with mine, and the presenter, or I should ask, how did I, or you might be looking at this and saying, well, how did you put those graphics in Bob, how did you put those graphics on the page without them actually being in the background? Because they're not in the background. All I did was I created 2 share pods and laid the yes and the no graphics, or the yes, it's legal and here's why, and the no, it's illegal and here's why. I just put those into share pods in the layout, and what I did with each of those graphics is I just matched the background of those graphics with the background that you see, the prime background that you see in the layout. So, or actually in the room. And I sized them so that you can't see the edges of the pods, and voila, it looks like the graphics are embedded into the layout, even though they're not. Now, this is a very simple use of graphics within the layout. So, of course, I started to think about how I could take this concept and make it even more engaging. And this is what I came up with. Now, we presented a situation based on diversity in which the manager had to make a hiring decision. Now, I could have done a poll or just a chat, but no, I wanted this to be more engaging than even more engaging. So taking the graphics concept I just showed you a minute ago, I created this graphic, the graphic on the upper right, with the underlying color being the same as my room background. Then I laid it into a share pod. Now, during the webinar, we asked managers to mark one of the 2 people with a check mark. Now, how do I do that? With something really cool in Adobe Connect called the Draw Tool, which I'll show you in just a second. And if you, by the way, if you haven't used Adobe Connect's Draw Tool before, I really highly encourage you to become familiar with it because it's great. You can do a lot of things with it. We presented this scenario and asked our learners to choose in the white box below each of the 2 pictures on the upper right using the Draw Tool. And in doing that, this is what we got. Hopefully you can see on the left side of the pod, just to the left of the gentleman there, on the left side of the pod, there are draw tools, those draw tools I was talking about. And as the host and producer, I enabled those draw tools so that the learners can use them. I instructed them on how to use the draw tool and asked them to place a check mark in either of the two white areas to make their selection. So get this. Now the learner doesn't simply make a selection in the middle of a presentation. I'm giving them the opportunity to actually draw. Now, how many of our learners were expecting to get to do that when they signed up for the webinar? Probably not a whole lot, if any, right? Now, do you think this engaged our learners? Absolutely it did. They had a ball with it and had to make a difficult decision in the process. Now, this scenario that we presented to them is a real life scenario. And once we revealed the correct answer, do you think our managers are going to remember what to do when they're faced with this scenario in real life when it comes up? You bet they will. This is learning retention that's supercharged. And as you can see in Adobe Connect, it was super easy to do. So my fourth principle is to create interactions that in the process are experiential, tactile, unexpected, and even fun. Now, it'll create a higher level of engagement with the benefit of higher learning retention. Now, if you have a multiple choice scenario, as you can see here, it's easy to expand your graphic with those choices so that they can, just select in a choice using the draw tool within any one of those. Now, what if I want to create an engaging poll pod? Yes, you can actually create poll pods that are even more engaging. And here's the answer. I created a little visual trickery here. To the learner, it looks like the poll and the photo of the two men are joined together as one element, and the "what would you do" graphical text is somehow overlaid on top of them. But actually, the graphical text and the photo are part of the same graphic and same pod. The background of the graphic is still the same color as my background for the room, so they appear to be fairly seamless. But as you can see by the outline there, it's one graphic laid into a pod with the poll pod laid over it, but sized so the poll is the same width as the photo. A lot of what I just explained honestly isn't going to matter to my learner, and in fact, I really don't even want my learner to notice it. But I do want my layout to be visually engaging because I know that high-level engagement leads to learning retention. Now, there's a lot going on in this layout, from the background to the share pod with the PowerPoint, to the share pod of the graphic and the poll pod. But it's all transparent so that from the learner's experience, the whole layout and interaction appears to be very simple. And that's the fifth and final principle. Make the complex things you do in Adobe Connect appear simple to the learner. But here's the kicker. Do it with exceptional creativity. Now, the reason I like using Adobe Connect so much is that it lets me discover new and creative ways to create engaging interactivity that sets the table for long-term learning retention. Now, I could go into the concepts of why you should never use bullets, why fewer points on a slide make your presentation more engaging, and so on. But I think for this presentation, hopefully anyway, I've given you enough to work with. Now, remember, this is what I started with, and through a process of working to make our webinars more engaging and ultimately create higher learning retention, this is where we are now. But honestly, I mean, I'm really confident that this isn't even close to where we'll be a year from now or even 2 years from now, because we're just going to continue to get more and more creative and really stretch Adobe Connect as far as we can stretch it. So as I wrap up, let's review 5 principles that I was wanting you to take away from this presentation, from my portion of the presentation. The first is to remember to add elements into your layout that help make your presentation more rich and engaging, such as the card that you see on the upper left. The second, have your learners process information that leads to them making decisions. Very effective, engaging concept that also has the benefit of learning retention. Third, create engaging processes in Adobe Connect that reinforce your concepts. Fourth, create interactions that are experiential, tactile, unexpected, and even, yes, fun, even fun. Finally, make the complex things you do appear simple to the learner. Now, by applying those 5 basic principles and by being creative applying them, you'll have a much more engaging learning event, but even more importantly, you'll have much higher learning retention. So, thank you very much for your time. I wish all of you the best in your upcoming learning events. Alistair.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. Some really phenomenal examples there of, as you said, making engagement fun. Before we wrap up, there's a couple of things that I'd just like to kind of talk back to. But as I do that, this is just an open chat pod. It's not a poll pod, so we can have a conversation. But I'd love to hear from the group here today. Based on what you've seen from Bob, based on what we talked about earlier, are there any ideas, or based on what you've seen from the chat pod today from other members of the e-learning community, are there things that you'll do going forward to increase engagement in your sessions? There's some really great examples I've seen in chat as we've been going through. As Bob's been speaking, I've just been kind of monitoring the chat and joining in on the conversation. There does seem to be a real theme around fun. There's 2 ideas in e-learning. One is gamification, which is setting up challenges, rewarding people who complete e-learning, very often used in on-demand learning. But there's also this idea of game-based learning. So these are 2 separate ideas. Gamification is like awarding points and turning the idea of learning into maybe a competition. And then game-based learning is actually using games within your learning environment to make the learning itself more fun or to make it competitive. Anna Maria had a phenomenal example of using an escape room, a digital escape room. And I'm not sure exactly how she's using that, but that's something that might work really well in breakout rooms. So if you want it to be a collaborative exercise, having people go into individual breakout rooms and work on solving a puzzle like an escape room, I think is a great idea. There's one example that I would put in my more advanced bucket for interactions, and that is for Adobe Connect, we've got this idea of custom pods where you can have essentially HTML applications running inside of your virtual classrooms. And one that I've actually written that's used, at least by me a lot, is a quiz game. Not unlike Jeopardy or something, but the idea behind this game is not that you're answering questions and kind of showing off your learning, but that it is time-based and that you're competing with everybody else in the virtual classroom. So there's this idea of competition. The faster you answer the question, the more points you get, and there's a leaderboard. Again, turning it into a game helps drive engagement, and that in the end helps drive this idea of retention. One of the things that Bob spoke about right at the beginning of his presentation. This is such a challenge, and it's why engagement is so important. It's because we want to drive up the retention rates. Some really phenomenal, some really great examples here of things people are going to do to increase engagement. Use more interactivity. Start with a poll. Start with a discussion. That's one of the things that I talked about in terms of designing learning interactions into your sessions, is setting that expectation, which can even come from the invitation that you send out might have an interaction as part of it. Before you join, tell me a bit about yourself. Have a question as part of that invitation to a virtual classroom. And then right as they come into the lobby, have a poll, have some chat, have some interaction to set those expectations. It also helps people get more comfortable with the technology that you're using to deliver the sessions as well. So it serves 2 purposes. It sets the expectations right from the beginning, and it helps familiarize your learners with the technology that you're using. Amy's having problem convincing tutors. This is another challenge, right? One of the things, obviously I come from the Adobe Connect world and I love Adobe Connect, but one of the core principles, regardless of what you're using, is to know your technology. Know what it can do, know what it can't do. Every platform has its own strengths and weaknesses. And the more that you have your tutors or have your instructors familiarize themselves with the technology, the more they understand what it's able to do, the more effective sessions that you can design. So that's part of the design process, is really understanding the features and the capabilities of the platforms that you're using. David, with virtual environments, with sound and 360 movement, with hotspots that can share information, so David's talking about VR, some really great examples there. Talk about immersive, talk about engaging. VR, I think, is about as immersive as you can get. This would definitely fall into the advanced bucket in terms of interactions requiring some work beforehand to create these environments. But the payoff for something like VR is absolutely massive. Uh, showing instructors how easy these tools can be, that's definitely part of that design phase, right? You can't design an effective session if you're not familiar with the technology. Using chat pods, multiple chat pods, to allow learners to explain the why of their answers. I love that. Bob had a great example. Instead of just using the agree to disagree buttons, those chat pods enable you to explain your reasoning, right? Going beyond just hitting a green or a red button, but actually having a discussion. And by using multiple chat pods, even if you've got your generic chat pod on your layout, adding 2 more chat pods really does help to focus the conversation, to drive more engagement, and in the end get better retention. So really great options there. I won't have time to read all of these, but some other fantastic examples. Excellent job. So I'm going to hand it back to Mel to wrap us up. We do have a set of evaluation polls just as we're heading out today. We would appreciate you just taking a moment to help us improve these sessions as we're going forward. So if you wouldn't mind helping us